Well, it is 3 o'clock. Meghna, you want to start?
Sure, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Meghna Sabarwal. I'm a professor and program head in the Public and Nonprofit Management program in EPS, which is School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences. So, welcome to the talk this afternoon on financing the war on drugs, the impact of law enforcement grants on racial disparities in drug arrests. This talk is sponsored by EPS, the School of Economic, Political Policy Sciences, and Scholars Strategy Network, which is SSN. For those of you who may not know of SSN, it is an organization of university-based scholars who are committed using these to improve policy and strengthen democracy. There are about 30 chapters in 26 states. There's a chapter, DFW has a chapter, so I welcome you all to look into it and join us. Please visit scholars.org and look for DFW chapter. I'm going to put a link in the chat so you all have access to it. So please look at that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to my dear colleague, Dr. Rodney Andrews, who is an associate professor of economics. Dr. Andrews will introduce our speaker. Dr. Andrews, take it away.
Hey, Rodney, you're muted. You got to unmute. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm happy to introduce good friend Jamein Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham is a labor economist, an urban economist. Received his bachelor's in economics from Michigan State University, a master's in economics from the University of North Texas, and a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, where we shared an advisor. So you'll forgive him for getting a bachelor's from Michigan State. He made the appropriate choice for his graduate, for his PhD. I think, given the events that we've observed in the past few years, as I said earlier, when Fira, you were on the call, I think the arc of what we need right now is bending towards Dr. Cunningham's research agenda. He has an interesting set of papers, the language of the unheard, legal services in the 1960s race riots, Don't Shoot, the impact of historical African-American protest on police killings of civilians, the evaluation of civil rights enforcement and the economic prosperity of minorities, and an event history analysis of the local conditions behind Black Lives Matter, right? And so, in these times where we are worried about sort of the very fabric of the country, especially for those who are the most vulnerable, I think it is excellent that we have a social scientist here, an economist here, that is focusing on these topics. And I look forward to a very informative presentation that will give us all something to think about and a platform upon which to build policies that might improve the United States and indeed the entire world. So, Dr. Cunningham, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Rodney, for that introduction. Although we both went to Michigan, I must say that my heart does lie with Michigan State. So I don't know if you guys can see my screen, my title slide. Is that okay? So I wish I was able to be in the DFW area. Me and my wife actually spent some time in the Dallas area, and so I'm kind of disappointed to be given the talk virtually, but I appreciate the opportunity to discuss my work. This is basically one of my projects where I study the social and institutional factors that may be contributing to racial disparities in the criminal justice system. It follows some basic lingering questions that I had from previous work in the 1960s that Rodney. And what I'm really trying to get a better understanding is how federal interventions influence local policing and may exacerbate racial disparities in police contact. And through a series of conversations that I had with my co-author on this paper, Robin Cox, we decided to look at the Edward Byrne program from the War on Drugs. And we decided to look at this program mainly because of the devastating impact the war on drugs had on Black and brown communities. But also, this is the second, I would say, coordinated federal intervention into local policing. The first one took place in the 1960s, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That was in response to urban uprisings, and it's difficult to do work in that era on police and on federal interventions into local policing, mainly because in 1960 there's a bunch of federal programs going into local communities as well as into the police. And so what we do is we take advantage of the fact that Reagan was a fiscal conservative. And this is the only really, and at least in the late 80s, the only federal program that's actually providing dollars to local policing. And so what I'll do today is I'll kind of motivate the question a little more, introduce our research question. Then I will give a little bit of information of national crime programs leading up to the war on poverty, basically talk about the war on crime, not war on poverty, the war on drugs. So I'll talk about the war on crime and the war on drugs a little bit. Introduce our research design, go over the results, and then if I have time, I'll go over what we're doing next, show you some preliminary results on the extensions related to this particular paper there. And then I think I have roughly an hour. Talk a little bit about the racial uprising lab that I have with my colleague, Rob Gillizow at the University of Victoria. Okay. So let's begin. It has been well documented that changes in public policies or public policies in general has contributed to historic rates of incarceration in the United States. This has been documented in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. But my favorite writing on this actually comes from Elizabeth Hinton, her work that discusses the criminalization of Black and brown communities through the war on crime, and which the war on crime on drugs. Now, as it relates to a lot of this research and sciences and public policy, a lot of it focused on changes in sentencing guidelines, changes in looking at the 3-strike laws or the sentencing disparities as it relates to crack versus powder cocaine. But there's not much work as it relates to looking at the direct involvement of the federal government using federal dollars to change police behavior. And we have little information on how that may have exacerbated or influenced racial disparities in police contact and the criminal justice system. Now, researchers in criminology and economics have studied these programs looking at the efficacy of policing and these federal interventions. In economics, it takes more of a public finance perspective, right? What happens when a local municipality receives these influx of federal funds? Do that change their spending behavior as it relates to public safety? And then it looks at if there's any changes as it relates to crime-related outcomes, such as changes in arrest, changes in crime rates. But that research, at least as it relates to the research on asset forfeitures from the war on drugs or the COPS program in the 1990s, none of that works really get at the question of how did the federal government contribute to racial disparities that we see in the criminal justice system. And so what we try to do in this paper is take a stab at it by starting with the fundamental questions that most of the research try to address. Do we see changes in the number of police or police personnel due to participation in these federal grant programs related to policing? Do we see changes in the crime rate? And we try to understand it, try to get a better understanding if there are any intended or unintended consequences related to race, and more precisely, can we link government programs that promote aggressive policing to prison growth that may have disproportionately impacted Black men? And we focus on the Byrne program from the war on drugs because, as I said, mentioned earlier, the war on drugs, but also, the implementation of the program in the late 80s is the only grants that are going to local policing related to the war on drugs. And we can take advantage of the variation and how the discretionary grants went to different municipalities, meaning there's there, and we can actually estimate a causal, we can actually back out a causal effect as it relates to federal disparities in the criminal justice system, or in our case, police contact. And just to give you a preview of what we find, just in case I have to speed up during the end, we find that the Edward Byrne program from the war on drugs is associated with a 36% increase in white arrests for drug sales. We also find that the program is associated with a 30% increase in black arrests for drug sales. So the percentage change for white arrests is going to be larger than for black arrests, but the baseline for black arrests, historically high arrest rates, the number of individuals coming in contact with the police due to drug sales is going to be much larger for black residents. We find no impact as it relates to drug possession, no impact as it relates to arrests for violent crimes. But we do find that 3 to 5 years after a city participates in the Byrne Grant program, crime drops by 3%, driven by a drop in property crime. And we also find that arrests for property crime actually decreased 4 years after participation in the program. When we test for racial disparities, we find that over the course of our sample period, there's 11 more arrests of black drug offenders for sales arrests relative to whites, right? So those are the findings that we have in this paper. So let me give you a little backdrop about exactly what we're studying, the program we're examining up to the Edward Byrne program. So the first federal, at least the coordinated federal intervention in local policing occurred during the 1960s, during a time where there was a rise in crime, especially violent crime. The rise in crime accompanied with urban uprisings in black communities generated bipartisan support for the federal government to intervene and support public safety initiatives at the local level. In 1965, a year after Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texan, declared a war on poverty, he also declared a war on crime. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the war on poverty, it was a federal commitment to alleviate the social ills associated with poverty by financing a series of experimental programs designed to improve the socioeconomic conditions of the poor. And so relatedly here, President Johnson sought to use federal funds to finance experimental programs related to policing. The idea was that the police can use the dollars in ways that the federal government may not, and it may lead to a reduction in crime and a reduction in uprisings in black communities. And so in 1968, Congress passed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Street Act, which established the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which I call LEA, shorthand. And that grant program allocated federal dollars to state and local law enforcement agencies to deal with the rising crime, the uprisings that were occurring, as well as organized crime. Allocated funds in two ways. There was a block grant that went to the state, and then there was discretionary funds that went directly to local municipalities, and that those funds were used to provide training. It was used to buy new equipment, as well as to hire additional police officers. And the thought was that the LEA grants was going to be the centerpiece for the war on crime, but quickly the support for the program began to wane. The lack of a clear leadership, lack of a clear mission, as well as bureaucratic red tape were often cited as impediments to the program's ability to fight crime. Also, the idea of just throwing money at crime-related problems were viewed as being too simplistic to deal with the complexities of crime. As crime rate continues to rise during the 1970s, public officials began to scrutinize how these grants were used. They often cited that there was little evidence that these grants were used to increase the number of police or actually prevent crime. And public officials grew more concerned about the possibility that federal funds were being misappropriated at the local level. And so in 1980, the federal government decided to dismantle this grant program to local policing. And in the 1980s or in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan came in and he took a fiscal conservative approach, cutting a lot of the federal spending to a variety of several programs. But by the mid 1980s, the crime was supplanted by the war on drugs. Violence surrounding the crack epidemic generated once again bipartisan support for federal intervention into local policing. And in 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act established the state and local assistance for narcotics control program. And this program was renamed the Edward Byrne Program in 1988 to honor a police officer that was killed in New York in February of that year. And similar to the LEA program, the Byrne program authorized block grants to state and discretionary grants to local municipalities to aid in training, buying new equipment, as well as hiring new police officers. But there were a couple of things that they learned from the LEA project or the LEA grant program. One, they had a clear mission to assist local law enforcement agencies for drug-related offenses, focusing on apprehension, prosecution, and detention, as well as rehabilitation of drug offenders. Also, to deal with the possibility of misappropriation of funds, they required that local municipalities match the grant, provide 25% of the total budget. To deal with the complexities of urban crime, they established these multi-jurisdictional drug task force units to deal with drug trafficking and drug sales that often involve multiple locations in different jurisdictions. Now, once the program was established and grants were being allocated, roughly 50% of the funds went to establish these multi-jurisdictional drug task force units. These task force units were viewed as being successful and vital to winning the war on they were championed as improving the communications between law enforcement agencies, and their popularity led to rapid expansion of these multi-jurisdictional drug task force. By 1991, over 900 task forces existed, and they were responsible for over 250,000 arrests in that year alone. Now, despite covering such a large percentage of the population, most of the urban population in the country, there's been little empirical, at least quantitative work on the Byrne program. There has been some government reports on the program, and that evidence basically shows that there's little causal evidence or empirical evidence that the program led to an increase in the number of pleas, increase in drug arrests, or a decrease in crime. And so what we do is we try to go back and re-examine, give it a fresh look. And to do this, we get information on the Byrne Grant Program from the Consolidated Federal Funds Report files. And the Consolidated Federal Funds Report provides information on all government spending. So this is publicly available information that you have access to due to your tax dollars. And we have information on the Byrne Grant. We have the date the grant is issued, the amount of the grant, and where the grant went to. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act was in 1986. The first grants were allocated in 1987. And so we focus on grants made from 1987 to 2004. In 2005, there was a reauthorization act combining several Department of Justice grant programs. And so we find that as a natural place to stop. To do our analysis, we get information on crime, and the main information comes from the Uniform Crime Report. We have is known and cleared by arrest, which gives us information on total crime, as well as total arrests. And these are felony counts of murder, rape, manslaughter, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, assaults, and burglary. And we also have information on the arrests and the characteristics of the individual who are arrested from the Uniform Crime Report, arrests by age, sex, and race. And we focus mainly, at least for this talk, we're going to focus mainly on arrest for drug possession, but we also look at other crime-related outcomes. And then we also have information on police employment or personnel from the law enforcement officers killed and assaulted, which gives us a count of the number of police officers in a particular agency at a given time. We supplement our analysis by also using data from the U.S. Census, from the city and county data books, which is publicly available at the ICPSR, as well as expenditures at the local level for policing from the state, from the U.S. Census of government. It gives us information on local revenues and local expenditures. And what we do in our analysis is we do an event study. And an event study allows us to see how the outcome variable of interest is evolving before and after. So I'm going to use treatment a lot. And so what I mean by treatment is going to be participation in the burn grant program, or you received a discretionary grant, right? We focus on discretionary grants because those grants went directly to local municipalities and they bypass state planning boards. And we take advantage of the location and the timing of when the city receives its first grant. Now, this usually works when I talk to other people, because I usually use Dallas and Fort Worth for an example. This is a terrible crowd to use this as an example. But typically, what we talk about taking advantage of the location, variation in location and timing. If you're not from Texas and you're not from the DFW, I would usually tell you that Dallas and Fort Worth are similar cities. Just one is larger and the other one is relatively smaller, right? But what I mean by taking advantage of the variation in timing is that Dallas will probably be treated first, followed by Fort Worth, meaning I can see how crime is evolving once you participate in the program in Dallas, and then compare it to Fort Worth, which is not treated at the time. And then Fort Worth will be treated later, and that will be my control group. All right, so I could take advantage of that variation, as well as I could take advantage of the variation in location, meaning it's possible that Dallas and Fort Worth is both treated, but Denton is not. And I can see how crime is evolving in these different places and compare them to Denton. Right, so this is what I mean by taking advantage of the variation in timing. And what I will show you is these pre-treatment effects and post-treatment effects, which give us the evolution of our outcome variable interest, which will be crime and arrest rates. And so our analysis will include a couple of things. First, we'll include city fixed effects. This will account for unobserved heterogeneity that is time invariant. So this would capture the fact that Dallas is a bigger city than Fort Worth, and bigger for a variety of reasons that we may not necessarily be able to find in the data. We also include state by year fixed effects, and this captures the fact that state policies change over time. Alabama may implement a separate set of public safety policies relative to Oregon, right? And then I also include these urban by year fixed effects, and this captures the effect that Dallas is a big police department, and they may be able to adjust once they receive a grant. Similarly, like Detroit, which is another big city with a big police department, so they might be more agile. Versus a smaller police department or a more rural police department may be more constrained in how they can adjust their personnel in order to do things when a new policy is implemented. And so this is basically dealing with urbanicity and how unobserved heterogeneity varies with city over time. Now, what's important for our analysis, I talked about all these fixed effects. What is important for our analysis is the fact that I am capturing how crime rates and drug arrest rates are varying over time. And I do this with these event year dummies, right? So I try to capture the time before and the relative time after you are treated or participate in the burn grant program. So for instance, if Dallas received a burn grant in 1990, I want to see how arrest rates are evolving up to 5 years before 1986, 87, 88, 89. And then I also want to compare that to how crime rate is evolving afterwards, right? And so these are going to be my event years. And my pre-treatment effects, PIEs is going to give me the average difference in treated cities relative to control cities as it relates to our outcome variable of interest, crime rates, arrest rates. And then I'm going to compare that to my post-treatment effects, which is going to give me the average difference in those outcome variables of interest after a city participates in the burn grant program. All right. So what we're going to do in this analysis is we're going to focus on crime and arrest rates between 1982 and 2009. We're going to limit the sample or restrict the sample to cities that have a population greater than 50,000 residents in every year. And then we're also going to restrict the sample to cities that report fully, meaning they report every month, for 27 out of 30 years from 1980 to 2009. And I focus on from 1980 to 2009 because I'm going to show you some things that we do to test to see if this is the right research design for this analysis. So to go over a couple of characteristics as it relates to the cities that are in our sample, we have over 223 cities in our sample, in which 135 of them participate in the Burn Grant program. We have 88 cities that do not. There are some key cross-sectional differences between those that participate in the program and those that do not. Those cities that participate are typically much larger. They're poor cities as the median income is lower, and they typically have a larger percentage of the population that is Black. They also have a higher share of female head of households. And as one would expect, given these differences, places that participate in the Burn Grant program also have higher crime rates. They typically have larger police departments, and they make more arrests as it relates to drug violations or drug sales and drug possession. A couple of things are interesting as it relates to racial disparities that we see at the baseline level, looking at pre-participation characteristics. The first thing to see is that drug arrest rates for Blacks are much larger than for whites. And the control group actually have higher arrest rates for Blacks than the treated group, those cities that participate in the program. Conversely, the treated cities have higher arrest rates for white residents as it relates to drug-related offenses. So we have some key differences here between those cities that participate in the program and those cities that do not participate in the program. So you may be thinking this is not necessarily a really good comparison group. Well, what's important for our analysis is not necessarily that these cities are different with their baseline characteristics. What is important here is that crime or crime-related outcomes are evolving similarly over time. So that's saying that if crime is going up in Dallas, crime is also going up in Fort Worth. And if crime is going down in Fort Worth, it's also going down in Dallas prior to participating in this program. And so our identification strategy relies on pre-existing trends in arrest and crime being exogenous to when a city receives its first grant. So exogenous meaning that's unrelated to when a city receives their first discretionary grant. And so we do a couple of things to kind of test for this. The first thing we do is on the horizontal axis, 1984 to 2009, that is the year you received your first grant. So we look at when cities receive their first grant, and do we see any correlation as it relates to crime rates before the Burn Grant is introduced? So we look at changes in crime between 1980 and 1985 for those cities that participate in the program. And we find no relationship there. That red line is just the line that best fits that data, and that is basically has a slope of 0 and is near 0. So it's going basically through the middle there, and it's not statistically significant. So we're not worried that places with where crime is growing is receiving a grant first. The second thing we care about is crime evolving similarly in places that do not participate in the program and those that do participate in the program prior to the first grant being made. So basically, is crime evolving similarly in Denton as it would be in Dallas prior to participating in the program? And what we see here, this is just looking at how crime is evolving. So the slope parameters, how crime is evolving in places that are treated relative to places that are not treated prior to 1987. And what we see here is that the difference in crime, or at least crime rates between the control group and the treated group, is essentially 0. This dashed line is the confidence interval. Right, so we are assured, at least by these simple tests, that we kind of have the right research design. But what's important for our event study methodology is that we also have a test of this embedded in the model, meaning we can look at our pre-treatment effects to see if there's any statistical difference in the outcome variable of interest before a city participated in the program. And I will show you that shortly. All right, so this basically summarizes those graphs that I just showed you. But what's important here is that our analysis will capture any trend break in crime and arrest rates caused by the introduction or participation in the Edward Byrne program, if those pre-existing trends assumption or the parallel trends assumption is satisfied. So first, a couple of technical notes before I go into the first set of results. We're going to show our crime-related outcomes by race. So I'm going to show you drug arrests by race. Our baseline model includes city, state by year, and urban by year fixed effects. And I'm also going to present confidence intervals, and those confidence intervals are constructed by using heteroscedastic robust standard errors clustered at the city level. And I'm going to focus on crime-related outcomes 5 years before and 5 years after participating in the Byrne Grant program. Okay, so first I'm going to show you the results as it relates to drug possession arrest for white residents. The first important thing to note is that this vertical line captures when a city participates in the program, and we're going to focus on what happens 5 years before and 5 years after. 5 years before and 5 years after participating in the program. So we're going to compare everything to that vertical line. And when I discussed that the test for the parallel trends is embedded in our analysis, is basically looking at these pre-trends, how crime, or in this case, drug possession arrests for white residents are evolving before participation in the Byrne Grant program. And what we show you here is that it's not statistically significant. These point estimates are negative. So the dashed lines here are going to be the confidence intervals. The shaded area in gray is going to be the 90% confidence interval. So a lot of times we talk about what's statistically significant. That is by using the dashed lines in black. And I say what's marginally statistically significant. That means that the 90% confidence interval, that's using this gray area if you're outside the gray area. Okay. So the pre-treatment effects are essentially 0. So if we were see a positive, or if a positive coefficient as it relates to our post-treatment effect, we can attribute it to participation in the program. Similarly, if we saw a negative post-treatment effects, we can attribute it to participation in the program. And what we show is that after participating in the program, we do find that the point estimates are positive, but they're not statistically significant, meaning we find no evidence that the Byrne Grant program actually led to an increase in drug possession arrests for white residents. When we look at drug possession arrests for black residents, once again, the pre-treatment effects are essentially 0, and the post-treatment effects are essentially 0. So we find no effect as it relates to drug possession arrests. Now, this is important because if you read the literature as it relates to mass incarceration and prison growth, a lot of it will point to drug possession arrests, the increase in especially federal, because state prisons, the population that are arrested for drug sales and drug possession is relatively small. But a lot of this is attributed to individuals being arrested for drug possession. And we find at least no evidence that the Edward Byrne program, at least the discretionary grants, contributed to that. Now, when we look at drug sales arrests, we do see something here. Our pre-treatment effects are negative. Our post-treatment effects are positive and statistically significant. However, we say that there is suggestive evidence that the Byrne Grant program led to an increase in white arrests. And we do this because the pre-treatment effects at year 5 years before treatment, or -5, is statistically significant. So it violates the parallel trend assumption. But if we were to interpret the point estimate that 3 years after participation, there's that indicates a 30% increase in white arrests for drug sales over the baseline rate prior to participation in the program. So a large percentage increase, but we're worried about violating the parallel trends assumption. When we look at black arrests for drug sales, we're not worried about the parallel trend assumption being violated here. The pretreatment effects are statistically close to zero and statistically insignificant. And once a city participates in the burn grant program, we see a large increase in drug sales arrests for Black residents. Now, there could be a variety of reasons why we would expect racial disparities in policing, especially as it relates to drug sales. One may be related to the fact that Blacks or African Americans often participate in drug markets that are outdoors, making it easy for the police to arrest them, given an additional resource. It may be the simple fact that the burn grant program and actually focused on a crack cocaine relative to a powder cocaine. It also has to do with the fact that there's a lot of provisions as it relates to actually focusing on areas where public housing and a variety of things such as of that order, right? And so it may be a variety of reasons why, at least according to literature, we would expect to have this increase as it relates to Black arrests relative to white arrests. And if we look at the point estimates here, this is a relatively large point estimate. This is 1.5 additional Black arrests for drug sales, which is a 30% increase over the baseline. Now, I showed you earlier the summary statistics that the arrest rates for Blacks for drug sales and drug possession was much higher. So this corresponds to a much larger increase as it relates to those individuals who are going to be participating or at least coming in police contact as it relates to drug sales. One of the interesting things, if we look at what's going on, that's a little bit different here, even though we're worried about the pre-trends, is that for white arrests, it increases and it increases slowly over time. And for Black arrests, it's an immediate increase. And so, one, this speaks to the nature of policing, right? There's already a high police presence in Black communities, right? And therefore, it may be relatively easier to increase the number of arrests. But as you start to participate more and more in the program and you start to hire more police officers, you may be able to focus on or at least police communities that are typically under police, therefore leading to this increase in white arrests for drug sales that we see in our analysis that kicks in 3 to 4 years after participating in the burn grant program. Right. So in our analysis, we do a variety of robustness checks, reasonable robustness checks, just to see if our estimate is really truly leading to an increase in drug sales arrests as it relates to the burn grant program. And as I mentioned, there's the suggestive evidence that we have an increase in white arrests. When we do this, we are presenting joint effects of what happens. What's the average effect 5 years before, and what's the average effect 5 years afterwards, and we focus on drug sales. And here, if we look at the pretreatment effects, the joint pretreatment effects for white drug sales arrests, it is statistically insignificant. And so we can interpret the joint treatment effect as a causal estimate. So we can attribute the increase in white arrests to the program here. All right. And once again, for Black arrests, we have the pre-treatment effects that are statistically indistinguishable from zero, and these post-treatment effects that are relatively large. The dashed line is going to go through our original estimate for our post-treatment effects. So one of the things that we do in this analysis is we include a lot of fixed effects, but we are worried that these key cross-sectional differences between the treated and control group should be accounted for in other ways. And so one thing that we do is we include those baseline characteristics from the 1980 census and interact it with a linear time trend. And by doing that, that has little effect on our estimates. Another thing we're worried about is that is about cities that fully report in a sample. We said that we restricted the sample to cities that report 27 out of 30 years. What happens if we use the cities that report fully every year? And when we do that, we get an impact on white drug sales arrests that is large, statistically significant, but the increase in Black arrests for drug sales is much smaller, and it's no longer statistically significant. So we are worried about the composition of our cities in our sample may be influencing our results. The main mechanism in which we think we are identifying an impact as it relates to drug sales comes from the establishment of these multi-jurisdictional drug task force units. By the nature of their name, we're worried about spillover effects, meaning those individuals should be able to arrest. A multi-jurisdictional drug task force unit in Dallas may be associated with arrests in Baylor and as well as in Denton, right? And so what we want to do is just take advantage of the variation in timing, just include those places that are treated early only. And what we find is a larger impact of the program for both white drug sales arrests and black drug sales arrests. To account for the possibility of spillover, what we say is that any city within 25 miles of a treated city is also treated. When we do that, we get smaller estimates than the treated only sample, but this is slightly larger than the original point estimates in our analysis. The last two things we do are related to making sure that we have the proper comparison group. One of the things that we can do, since we're looking over a longer time period from places treated in 1987 to 2004, we can split our treated group from those who are treated earlier to those who, and compare them to those who are treated later. So we look at those places that are treated between 1987 and 1992, and we can compare them to the cities that are treated after 1998. And that way we have a 5-year window when we can look and see how cities in the early treated group are compared to those cities that are treated later, right? And this is basically trying to get at the proper comparison group. And when we do that, we get larger estimates. They're a little bit noisier, but we are finding an increase in drug sales arrests for black residents and white residents due to participation in the Burn Grant program. And lastly, I haven't said or mentioned anything about the violent crime bill in 1994, which introduced the COPS program. The money from that bill was the money spent on local policing from that bill is much more than what was spent in the Burn Grant program. So we may be worried that our estimates is just picking up the COPS program. And so what we did was we focused our analysis on cities that are treated prior to 1991, and so that when we look at the 5 years after treatment, we're not worried about confounding effects of the COPS program. And when we do that, once again, we get large post-treatment effects. And so one might say by looking at the study that a lot of the evidence that are related to the COPS program may be contributed to the Burn Grant program. And so individuals should be worried about confounding effects when they look at those COPS programs in the 1990s and the 2000s. Lastly, here, what I want to show you is what we do to look at racial disparities. So we show that there's an immediate increase in black arrests for drug sales and an increase in white arrests for drug sales that happens slowly over time. Here, what we do is we do a triple diff in diff, where we take advantage of the variation in location and timing, as well as the race of the individuals who are arrested. So we have black arrests for drug sales and white arrests for drug sales. And so when we do this, what we're showing is that when the city receives a grant, for those who participate in the program, black arrests increase relative to white arrests in treated cities relative to those places that never participated in the program, right? And this is basically one additional black arrest per 1,000 residents. Now, we also look at some other crime-related outcomes. We look at total crime, and we find violent crime, and we find no evidence that the Burn Grant program decreased violent crime, so no effect on violent crime. We also look at violent crime arrests. Part of the original bill looked at drug-related offenses as well as violent crime because they were concerned about the violence surrounding drug trafficking. And we look at violent crime arrests for our black residents. We find no effect there. And we look at violent crime arrests for white residents. We also find no evidence that the program changed the number or the rate at which they are arresting white individuals. Interestingly, what we do find is a decrease in total crime. And we find a decrease in total crime that occurs 3 years after participating in the program. And that's, if we compare the reduction in the crime rate to the baseline level, that's a 3% decrease in crime 3 to 5 years after participating in the Burn Grant program. And we find that decrease in total crime is driven by a decrease in property crime. especially since we find no effects as it relates to violent crime. And then lastly, we find that the decrease in total crime results in a decrease in total arrests 4 to 5 years after. So after we see a decrease in crime, we see a decrease in arrests, and that decrease in arrests is driven by a decrease in property crime. So we're curious about the mechanisms. So the burn grant program, at least the discretionary grant, could be used for a variety of things. But like I mentioned before, roughly half of the funds initially were used to create or establish these multi-jurisdictional drug task force units. And we believe that by creating these multi-jurisdictional drug task force units, that is driving our increase in arrests for drug sales. And we do find suggestive evidence that there's an increase in the number of sworn police officers 2 years after treatment. However, we worry that the parallel trends assumption is violated, and 3 years before, we have a negative pretreatment effect that is statistically significant, therefore making us cautious to interpret this as a causal estimate. We also have suggestive evidence that the program led to an increase in expenditures on public safety. However, this is gradual and it never becomes statistically significant, at least at the 95% confidence level. So that leads us to question if we only finding suggestive evidence that there's an increase in the policing or funding towards policing, especially if we look at police expenditures. We have an immediate increase in Black arrest once you participate in the program, but we're not seeing an immediate increase in expenditures towards public safety. What else may be driving our result? Well, one thought is that a federal commitment to fight a war on drugs may improve police morale, right? And there's been research that shows that changes in police morale may influence productivity. There's research that shows when the police union wins an arbitration, that leads to an increase in productivity measured by arrest rates. There's also literature that shows that federal interventions in response to police misconduct decreases police morale and lead to a decline in police productivity measured by arrest rates and crime rates, right? So it is possible that a federal commitment to support local law enforcement efforts in the war on crime change police productivity without actually, even if local municipalities use those federal dollars to offset their spending on public safety. Another way we could think about this is entrepreneur policing actually became a term that was used as it relates to the war on drugs and introduced in the 1980s. And the thought here is that the burn grant program is actually not a big spending program. As I mentioned, the Reagan administration was fiscally conservative. And so these burn grant programs are not a huge pot of money. But so we can think of this, the burn grant program, as like seed money. This is the university may provide seed money for professors to actually go get bigger grants. We could think of the burn programs as seed money to build an infrastructure for local police departments to fight the war on drugs. And you can use asset forfeitures to actually finance overtime or hiring additional police officers. And there's a lot of literature in criminology that kind of look at the incentives or misincentives of asset forfeiture laws. So I think I have 13 minutes. And so what I'll do is quickly just give a recap of what this paper finds, is that we find this increase in drug sales arrests, and we also that disproportionately impacts Black residents. We can plot these racial disparities in arrest over time, and we see that most of the disparities in arrests occur early on when the city's when the program is first introduced. And we can sum this up, and that's roughly 11,000 additional individuals that have police contact due to drug sales. We also find that the program is associated with lower levels of crime, and this is related to other literature as it relates to the COPS program. They find lower crime rates in response to grants given to local municipalities to hire additional police officers. They also find that there's some evidence that local municipalities offset spending on public safety. safety. But we can see this decrease in crime occurring due to the burn program before actual crime rates decrease, and also before on the introduction of the COPS program. So like I mentioned earlier, it's possible that literature on the COPS program may be producing biased estimates because they're not accounting for the burn grant program. All right. We believe that what's causing this may not necessarily be an increase in the number of police. It's possible that local police departments are reorganizing themselves to establish these multi-jurisdictional drug task force units, by not necessarily actually increasing the number of officers. We do find suggestive evidence, but we kind of have a discussion in this paper about why we find these relatively large increases in Black arrests relative to white arrests, and we mainly attribute it to the way policing is conducted in general, having a large police presence in Black communities prior to participating in this program, and therefore the added incentive to focus on drug offenses, especially crack cocaine, leads to this racial disparities and arrest of Black residents, and therefore any time we think of a colorblind approach to the criminal justice system, we also need to think about the unintended consequences if we was to think that the racial disparities in this program is unintended. But what's really important here is that the thing of effective criminal justice policies, we don't just want to look at local policies. I have a set of other papers that kind of really try to get at this, is that it's not just looking at what state and local law enforcement are doing, but it's also looking at the federal incentives that may be driving certain behavior at the local level. And this is evidence as it relates to the burn grant program. Okay. And so the natural question as it relates to what's going on here is that we may be curious of how that leads to prison growth. As I mentioned, we're worried about prison growth that disproportionately impacts Black men. So quickly kind of show you where this research is going. We are going to look at incarceration, and we take advantage of, once again, this variation. And what I really want to show you quickly here is the time series as it relates to prison admissions, the data that we have from beginning in 1983. And we see this increase in prison admissions for both Black and white residents, and we see this sharp increase that takes place in roughly 1987 when this program is implemented, and it flattens out in the early 1990s for Blacks. And if we split this up by the treated and control group, we see something that is very interesting here, and we're still trying to figure this out. We see a flattening as it relates to prison admissions of Black residents in treated places versus the control, and we see a divergence for white arrests. And so if we were to do a similar type of analysis to what I showed you as it relates to police contact for drug sales, and we look at prison admissions, we actually see this decrease in prison admission of Black residents that takes place 3 to 4 years after participation in the burn grant program, the discretionary part of the grant. And so the question becomes, what is driving this, right? We see no effect here as it relates to white arrests. And so our work on this area really has to start looking at the difference between going to state prisons versus county jails, the difference between felony offenses and community supervision. So, and then also to see how does this relate as far as the economic welfare of individuals in this city, in those counties that participate in the burn grant program. So I know you guys have questions. I tried to cover a lot in a short amount of time, and I want to give you guys the opportunity to ask me questions. Now, I have this slide here because I am the co-founder of our Racial Uprisings Lab. We received a small grant from the University of Victoria, and we've been collecting data on protests, trying to link violent protests from the 1960s to the Black Lives Matter social movement, to kind of extend some of the research that we've been looking at. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm very interested in federal intervention and local policing, and a lot of this is going to be in response to protests, shifting the behavior of police as well as public officials at the local level. But what I think I want to do, Rodney, is open it up for questions. Okay.
There is a hand up from first year doctoral student Rafi Ahmad.
Hi.
Rafi, okay.
Hi. Thank you very much for the very informative talk, Dr. Cunningham. I lived in Los Angeles County for over 30 years, near Los Angeles City, and back in late 1980s and early 90s, the LAPD, at that time it was Chief Darrell Gates, so who advocated the chokehold and other kind of tactics, inhumane. And at that time, what they were doing is they were planting the evidence in the cars and in the houses of the Black residents who were innocent residents and then arresting them.
Mm-hmm.
And they got away for a very long time. And fortunately, some whistleblower, a conscientious cop, he just spelled it out, and then they started looking into it. They found investigation found that the many Black innocent people were arrested and sentenced unjustly. I wonder if you have looked into that kind of scenarios in Dallas or Fort Worth, because the sentiment of the police department is that the union will protect at all costs their members, and they will hide their crimes with the code of silence. Was that looked into in your study? Thank you.
Okay, so for this particular study, no. So we haven't looked particular into, say, one particular police department. In our paper, however, we do have a discussion of the multi-jurisdictional drug task force unit that covered Hearn, Texas, and there's actually a documentary on at least perceived violations of that task force as it relates to racial disparities, planting drugs, individuals pleading out. Even though they felt, they're innocent, had the ability to fight this in court and having a confidence that you can win, and dealing with local law enforcement that may be being overly aggressive and predatory, really changed community behavior. So we do have that discussion, and that's what I meant by the misincentives associated with seed money for the war on drugs. Especially, we think that police departments are financing themselves through asset forfeitures. The other aspect to your question as it relates to police unions, it's not in this paper and I did not present it, but we do have a paper that look at the rollout of collective bargaining rights across the United States, which was mainly actually in response to these uprisings in the 1960s. As I said, almost all my work goes back to the 1960s. And what we do so is that when a location or state adopt collective bargaining rights, we do see an increase in police killings of civilians. So you're protected by the union, you're more likely to use lethal force. And there's other work that looks at collective bargaining agreements in general. So what we're trying to do is actually apply for grant money so we can actually start going into the particular provisions or contracts negotiated with local police departments. The problem there is that contracts change. And so we got to figure out a research methodology to deal with the fact that a contract is established and contracts change over time. But we're actually curious about the particular provisions as it relates in that case to use of force. But police can do other things that decrease the welfare of communities or individuals that interact with them.
Thank you, Dr. Cunningham, very much.
Dr. Edward Chorney, go ahead, please. You're muted.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Forgive my voice. How y'all doing? I'm from the 60s, and Dr. Ahmed, and I'm from New York, but I'm in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. However, the grants that you're talking about, did they show anything for mental health versus crime and jobs versus crime? Because I see two things when it comes to crime, is that with the police, or rather the perpetrators, or who we call the criminals, there's a reason for what they do and trying to survive out in that neighborhood. And back in the 60s, like Ahmed said, in the 60s, they pumped drugs into the Harlem area and everything, and the cops did that. Then you had Reagan with the Ira-Contra, which they pumped drugs and stuff into the neighborhood. But my thing is, did anyone think in the study of that grant money, did any of that grant money go to the mental health of these criminals? Because a lot of them, they had problems.
Well, as it relates to the grant, we're focused on a discretionary grant. Those funds were used for a variety of reasons, not just for hiring additional police, not just for police equipment. Just a majority of those funds went for that. But funds did go for rehabilitation purposes. Funds went to state, and the states also used funds for prisons and for hospitals and drug rehabilitation programs. But as it relates to mental health, I don't recall coming across anything related to those grants in mental health. However, if we think about the rise in crime in the 1960s and mental health, the expansion of Medicaid is explicitly tied to a decrease in funding as it relates to these state mental hospitals. And we do it's not in this paper, it's other work that I have with Andrew Bacon Goodman. We do find a relationship between funding of Medicaid, state hospital populations for mental illness, and changes in murder and police killings of civilians is just not strong enough. And so we're really trying to do additional work to kind of tease that out. But we are aware of that relationship that exists as it relates to mental illness in the Black community, as well as funds devoted towards mental illness and trying to figure these things out, think about it more deeply. But I must admit, what we're doing is kind of superficial in the sense that we really can't get at the structural issues in which you were talking about in that analysis, and that's why there's no paper on it yet.
But since we know about it now, we can't excuse it for a future study.
Right.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you much.
Rafi, is that an old hand? We have Dan. Dan, please go ahead.
Trying to get my hand up. I just wanted to, Jamein, I'm Dan Arce, I'm the head of the econ department. I want to thank you for this. I also wanted to sort of speak out to the graduate students who are watching this, because I've got to say, this is the first empirical presentation that I've ever seen where I did not see a single table or an asterisk. So it was really great, right? So everything was in terms of the magnitudes of the effects, and as a form of presentation, I found it to be basically superior to almost anything I've seen in terms of the presentation of empirical results. So thank you very much for that.
No, thank you.
Again, I hope the graduate students are paying attention, that you just don't have to make a PowerPoint slide of the table from the paper in order to get your point across. Right, so.
Thank you.
Oh.
Rodney has his hand up too.
So when I introduced you earlier, Jamein, sort of said something about a couple of things about how it is that your research, which looks backwards, certainly speaks to many of the social inequalities and problems that we're dealing with currently. Sort of given your research agenda, and if you would like, in particular, focusing on the paper today, what does looking back at those policies then say about things that we should be careful to think about right now?
Yeah, that's easy. Unfortunately, a lot of our public officials are not original, and so they implement pass bills. So one of the things that Jeff Sessions wanted to do for some odd reason was to fight the war on drugs. Like, he was really adamant about implementing and prosecuting individuals for marijuana. And actually, he mentioned putting more money into the grant programs. The burn program still exists, but it's combined with several other programs. And so if that was the case, we can say, well, we know exactly what happens when you put federal dollars in policing for drugs. It does exactly what you want it to do. It leads to an increase in arrests, and it disproportionately impacts African American men, right? So we can look at these policies and say, well, we know what the outcome is. Is this the outcome you want? And then also, our future research is going to say, is this good or bad? What is the welfare impact of these programs? Also, as it relates to dealing with police reform in general, it is important to know what worked and what didn't work. What leads to racial disparities in the criminal justice system? What leads to racial disparities in police use of force? And can we learn anything about it? So there's a lot of work that says there's racial disparities that exist in police contact. There's not much that says empirically we can show what is driving these racial disparities. And if we're going to have police reform or have that conversation, we need to know exactly what's driving it.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question.
Just have a comment, and just wanted to say that, you mentioned that the property crimes went down as a result of the grant. And the thing is, during that time, the technology improved so fast, drastically, that the protection measures, the security measures, the safety measures using the technology, they helped a lot in decreasing the property crimes, both in the automobiles and also in the housings. And that might have been a factor in the decrease of the property crimes, not necessarily as a result of the grant. That's what I wanted to say as a comment. Thank you.
Thank you for pointing that out. And our research, so if that is the case, we would expect that the changes in technology led to a decrease in property crimes, not only in places that received burn grants, but places that did not receive burn grants. So we would expect at least the argument that we would make is that we capture those things with including these year fixed effects. The other argument, or at least a little bit of pushback that I would give to that, is that we take advantage of the fact that there are places that participated in the burn grant program in like the early 1990s, but there's also programs that participate in the program in the early 2000s. Right, and the technology in that time frame is going to be totally different, and we still see that decrease in crime and decrease in property crime across the variation that we have in timing. So it is important that we do think about there's changes in technology that might be influencing. It's also changes in technology that's making police more effective at doing their job, and if that's the case, we may not be capturing or accounting for that as well, and so that may be a limit to our analysis.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dean Holmes has a question, and then
I think this is just a closing comment and thank you. You know, it's such a treat to have somebody give a talk at this level with such precision and relevance. But really, you've touched on at least 5 of our PhD programs. You know, you add a little bit of spatial and you got them all, right? You're just missing GIS, but this is fantastic. I'm looking at the names. We've got really people from across the school. We also, earlier on, we had our speaker of the Faculty Senate who attended as well. And so I think this is really great, just visibility for us and for you. So it's been wonderful. I saw this publication in JPAM, and I reached out to Rodney and I said, we got to have him come give a talk. So thank you for making time for us. My apologies that we're virtual on Teams instead of you being in one of our new conference rooms. But you know, we had so many people we wouldn't have fit. So that's at least one silver lining. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I do wish I was in Dallas though.
Yeah, we could give you some barbecue, you know, like Yeah, you know, you probably, well, you're in Memphis, so
I'm
maybe
in
we'll find
Memphis.
something different. But you know,
Style,
yeah, but
different
you know,
style of barbecue
Yeah,
run.
different style.
well, Dr. Arce has some Memphis connections, but I don't know about the Memphis barbecue. I'm skeptical.
In Texas, the meat is better.
Always.
Yeah, we're brisket. What Memphis barbecue is more, is it more pork with sauce?
Yeah, it's more pork, and then it's this the rub that is the sweet and hot. So that drives the taste.
Yeah, nothing beats a good brisket.
Public policy, crime, economics, and barbecue. What can't you do, man?
Hey, exactly.
All right, well, I appreciate it. I appreciate the time, and Rodney, I know we gotta chat.
Yeah, we do. All right.
All right, take care, all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Take care. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.